The snow whispered its secrets as it fell in thick, muffling waves, blanketing the high plains in a cold, indifferent embrace. The wind, sharp and biting, curled around the bare cottonwoods, their gnarled branches reaching like twisted fingers into the gray winter sky. Hooves crunched through the fresh powder, slow and deliberate, each step a quiet echo in the frozen wilderness. Isaac Wilder leaned into the chill, the brim of his battered hat pulled low, shadowing a face carved by years of sun and sorrow. His coat hung heavy on his shoulders, patched and stiff from too many winters and too few warm fires. A rifle balanced across his back, the leather strap creaking against his worn duster with every sway of his horse. He carried no badge, wore no brand. Only his eyes spoke, and even they had learned the language of silence. Ahead, smoke curled from the chimney of a small cabin, its thin line cutting through the ashen sky. Wilder reined in his horse, eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. The cabin sat alone, a lonely silhouette against the sprawling white, surrounded by a crooked fence and a sagging barn half buried in snow. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching into the ice-crusted earth, breath clouding around him like a ghost. He tied his horse to a bare pine, hand resting on the stock of his rifle, and moved toward the cabin with the careful steps of a man who had forgotten what it meant to feel at home. Isaac Wilder rode through the biting wind, his horse's breath steaming in the frigid air, the crunch of hooves on snow the only sound for miles. The landscape around him stretched stark and silent, white hills rolling into the distance, broken only by the jagged silhouettes of leafless trees. The sky hung low, thick with gray clouds that promised more snow before dusk. He pulled his hat down lower, the brim shielding his face from the bitter wind that cut through his worn coat like a knife. The rifle slung across his back felt heavier than usual, its weight a constant reminder of the choice that had brought him this far. He had left the warmth of the saloon 2 days ago, the echo of a whispered offer still ringing in his ears. A job that paid well, a deed with no papers, just a patch of land and a stubborn widow with a boy. The man's words had been soaked in whiskey and spite, his breath foul with the stench of cheap tobacco. "She's a squatter, a trespasser," the man had spat, waving a thick hand toward the distant hills. "Alone but for a boy. No deed, no claim. That land's mine by rights. Clear it, and you're paid." Isaac had taken the coin without a word, his jaw clenched, his eyes shadowed beneath the wide brim of his hat. The cabin came into view just as the sun slipped behind the hills, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow. It was a modest place, logs weathered and darkened by seasons of harsh winds and hard rains. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and gray against the twilight sky, a lone thread of warmth in a frozen world. A small wooden cross leaned beside the porch, half buried in snow, its rough edges softened by the frost. Isaac's jaw tightened at the sight, a bitter twist pulling at the corners of his mouth. He had buried enough of his own to know what it meant to mark the dead. He reined his horse to a halt beneath a bare cottonwood, its twisted limbs reaching into the sky like the fingers of a drowned man. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching through the snow, as he led his horse behind a cluster of rocks. The animal's breath came in short, sharp puffs, ears flicking nervously at the silence that clung to the place. Isaac patted the mare's neck, his calloused fingers brushing the frost that had gathered in her mane. "Easy, girl," he muttered, his voice a rough whisper that felt out of place in the pristine quiet. He settled himself behind the rocks, rifle cradled across his lap, eyes fixed on the cabin. A faint light flickered in the single window, shadows moving inside. He watched as the door creaked open, a boy stepping out, his small frame bundled in a coat 2 sizes too big, the sleeves flapping as he stumbled down the steps. He carried a bundle of firewood against his chest, arms straining with the weight. Isaac's jaw tightened as the boy crossed the yard, his boots crunching softly in the snow. The child paused beside the small cross, his head bowing for a moment, his lips moving in silent prayer. Isaac felt something cold and sharp twist in his chest, a memory unbidden and unwelcome. The boy straightened, his breath fogging in the cold as he turned back to the cabin. Isaac watched him disappear inside, the door creaking shut behind him, the light in the window flickering once before steadying. He leaned back against the rough stone, letting the rifle rest against his shoulder, his mind churning with thoughts he had long tried to bury. The image of the boy, his small hands brushing snow from the cross, clung to his mind like a burr. As the night deepened, Isaac's fingers grew numb around the cold metal of his rifle. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the rough stone, the wind whispering through the branches above like the ghost of an old friend. His mind drifted, slipping into memories of a time before the land turned cold, before he had become a man who rode into the wilderness to do another man's dirty work. He saw his wife's face, her smile framed by the morning light streaming through their cabin window, the sound of her laughter mixing with the crackle of the hearth fire. He remembered the way her hand had felt in his, warm and strong, her fingers laced through his as they stood on the porch, watching their son play in the yard. The memory cut through him like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. When he opened his eyes again, the stars had emerged, their cold light stretching across the sky in a thin, fragile web. The cabin remained dark and silent, the smoke from the chimney curling slowly into the frigid air. Isaac shifted his weight, his knees stiff from the cold, his breath coming out in short, misty puffs. He tightened his grip on the rifle, the old metal biting into his palm, and leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as a shadow crossed the window. The woman, her figure bent over the stove, her hair pulled back in a loose braid that hung down her back, her movements slow and deliberate as she tended to whatever meager meal she had managed to scrape together. Isaac closed his eyes again, the cold settling deep into his bones. He would wait for morning, let the frost creep into his veins, let the silence wrap around him like a shroud. He had made his choice, taken the coin, accepted the weight of another man's grudge. But as he sat there, the snow gathering at his feet, the wind whispering through the trees, he wondered if he would find the strength to follow through when the time came. When he finally drifted into a restless sleep, it was not the cold that chilled him, but the sound of a child's whispered prayer lingering in his mind. The morning broke gray and brittle, the kind of cold that seeped into bones and made old wounds ache. Isaac woke slowly, his back stiff from a night spent against frozen stone, his breath fogging the air as he blinked away the remnants of troubled dreams. He flexed his fingers, feeling the slow return of warmth as blood crept back into his joints, and glanced toward the cabin. The smoke still curled from the chimney, thin and steady, a small, stubborn thread of life against the wide, indifferent plains. He reached for his rifle, the metal cold against his palm, and rose to his feet, stretching the stiffness from his legs. His horse watched him from the shadow of the rocks, her breath steaming as she stomped a hoof against the frozen ground, restless but obedient. Isaac patted her neck, whispering a few low, calming words before stepping away, his boots crunching through the thin crust of ice that had formed overnight. The cabin door creaked open, and the boy stepped out again, his small frame hunched against the cold, his breath coming in short, sharp puffs as he trudged toward the woodpile beside the house. Isaac watched him work, the boy's movements careful and precise as he stacked the logs, his gloved hands moving with the slow, practiced rhythm of someone used to hard, unending labor. The boy paused once, glancing over his shoulder toward the tree line, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows before returning to his task. Isaac ducked back behind the rocks, his heart thudding in his chest, a long-buried instinct pushing him to stay hidden. When the boy returned inside, the door creaked shut, and the light in the window flickered as the fire was stoked back to life. Isaac leaned back against the rocks, his breath coming slow and measured as he steadied himself. He had faced down gunmen in smoky saloons, had ridden hard into ambushes with bullets whistling past his ears. But the sight of that small, solitary figure moving through the snow had shaken something loose in him, something he had thought long dead. An hour passed, the cold gnawing at his resolve, before the door opened again and the woman stepped out. She moved quickly, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her dark braid trailing down her back like a rope. She crossed the yard with purpose, her boots crunching through the snow as she made her way to the chicken coop. Isaac watched her pull open the small, sagging gate and bend low to collect the morning's eggs, her breath fogging the air as she muttered softly to the nervous hens. Her movements were quick, efficient, each step calculated to conserve energy in the biting cold. She straightened, her eyes drifting toward the tree line, and Isaac felt his breath catch as her gaze swept over the rocks where he hid. She paused for a moment, her head tilting slightly, as if sensing something out of place, then turned and hurried back to the cabin, the door creaking shut behind her. Isaac exhaled, his breath misting the air in short, jagged bursts as he let his head fall back against the stone. He closed his eyes, the rough texture of the rock pressing into his scalp, and tried to force his mind back to the task at hand. He had been paid to clear the land, to drive the squatters from their home, to put a bullet between the eyes of anyone who stood in his way. But now, with the image of the boy kneeling beside the small wooden cross burned into his mind, the weight of his rifle felt like a chain around his neck. As the sun crept higher in the sky, the cold began to break, the wind shifting from a bitter whisper to a slow, steady sigh. Isaac took a deep breath, feeling his lungs expand against the tightness in his chest, and forced himself to stand. He slung the rifle across his back, the metal cold against his spine, and took a step toward the cabin, his boots sinking into the softening snow. He would see this through, he told himself, if only to silence the small, stubborn voice that had begun to whisper doubts into his mind. He reached the edge of the clearing, the cabin looming before him, smoke still curling from the chimney, the windows glowing with the faint, flickering light of a fire. He paused, his hand resting on the butt of his rifle, and took a long, steadying breath. Then he stepped into the yard, his boots crunching through the snow as he approached the front porch. The small wooden cross leaned beside the steps, its rough edges weathered and worn, the snow around its base trampled by small, booted feet. The door creaked open, and the boy stepped out, his eyes going wide as he caught sight of the stranger standing in the yard. He took a half step back, his small hand tightening around the doorframe, his breath fogging the air as he opened his mouth to speak. Isaac held up a hand, his voice low and rough as he spoke. "I'm just passing through, looking for shelter." The boy hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the rifle slung across Isaac's back, then back to the man's face. He glanced over his shoulder, his small frame tense with uncertainty, before nodding slowly and stepping aside, the door creaking open wider to reveal the flickering fire within. Isaac stepped inside, the sudden warmth of the cabin wrapping around him like a thick, woolen blanket. He paused in the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the dim light as the boy closed the door behind him. The woman stood by the stove, her dark eyes sharp and wary, one hand resting on the handle of a heavy iron skillet. She met his gaze without flinching, her jaw set, her shoulders squared. "You alone?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Isaac nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "For now." The fire crackled in the hearth, the warmth creeping into his bones, chasing away the chill that had settled deep into his flesh. Isaac felt the weight of the rifle against his back, the cold metal pressing into his spine, a reminder of the choice he had yet to make. He glanced at the boy standing by the door, his small hands clenched into fists, his sharp eyes watching the stranger with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Isaac met the boy's gaze, his jaw tightening as the silence stretched between them. The crackle of the fire, the only sound in the small, dimly lit room. The morning light filtered through the small, cracked window, casting pale ribbons across the cabin floor. The fire had burned low during the night, its embers glowing like the eyes of old watchful spirits. Isaac stirred in the chair by the hearth, his limbs stiff, his back aching from the awkward, upright sleep. He flexed his fingers, feeling the roughness of calloused skin against the smooth grain of the rifle stock still balanced across his knees. The boy was already awake, moving quietly around the small space, his bare feet whispering against the worn wooden planks. He stoked the fire with a long iron poker, adding small, dry sticks from the pile beside the hearth, until the flames licked up hungrily, filling the cabin with a soft, crackling warmth. Isaac watched him through half-lidded eyes, his mind still fogged with sleep, the echoes of old, half-remembered dreams clinging to the edges of his consciousness like smoke. The woman emerged from the small side room, her dark braid falling over one shoulder, her sharp eyes catching the firelight as she paused in the doorway. She glanced at Isaac, her expression guarded but not unkind, then moved to the stove, her movements quick and precise, as she set a pot of water to boil. The boy watched her, his small hands folded in his lap, his head tilted slightly to one side, as if waiting for some unspoken command. Isaac straightened in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight, and cleared his throat. The woman's eyes flicked toward him, one brow arching slightly in silent question. He hesitated, his tongue thick in his mouth, the words slow to form. "Thanks for the shelter," he muttered, his voice rusty from years of silence. "Didn't mean to intrude." She nodded once, turning back to the stove as the water began to bubble, steam rising in thin, twisting tendrils. "A storm's a storm," she replied, her tone flat, matter-of-fact. "Nobody ought to be out in it alone." The boy glanced between them, his eyes sharp, curious. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it, his small shoulders hunching slightly as he looked down at his bare feet. Isaac felt a pang of something like shame twist in his gut, the boy's unspoken question hanging heavy in the warm fire-lit air. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and met the boy's wide-eyed gaze. "Name's Isaac," he said, his voice a shade softer. "Isaac Porter." The boy hesitated, his small hands clenching and unclenching in his lap, then glanced up at his mother. She gave a slight nod, her dark eyes flicking toward Isaac, then back to the pot of water on the stove. The boy took a deep breath, his thin chest rising and falling quickly, then spoke in a small, clear voice. "I'm Eli, and this is my ma, Anna." Anna's shoulders stiffened slightly at the introduction, but she didn't correct the boy, her hands moving steadily as she measured out a handful of dried herbs and dropped them into the pot, the sharp, clean scent of pine and sage filling the cabin as the leaves began to steep. Isaac nodded, his gaze shifting from the boy to the woman by the stove. "Appreciate the hospitality," he said, his voice low, almost gruff. "Ain't something I've seen much of lately." Anna didn't reply, her focus still on the small bubbling pot before her, the thin lines around her mouth tightening slightly at his words. Isaac leaned back in his chair, the worn wood creaking beneath him, and let his eyes wander over the small, neatly kept cabin. The walls were rough-hewn logs, their surfaces darkened by years of smoke and weather, the floorboards worn smooth by countless footsteps. A few small handmade shelves lined the walls, their rough edges filled with neatly folded linens and carefully arranged tin plates and cups. A single faded quilt hung over the doorway to the small side room, its edges frayed but meticulously mended, the patchwork pattern catching the firelight in soft, muted hues. Eli stood suddenly, his small, bare feet slapping against the cold, wooden floor as he moved to the small, glassless window beside the door. He peered out into the gray morning light, his breath fogging the cracked wax-papered pane as his sharp eyes scanned the snow-covered yard. He turned back to his mother, his small face tight with concern. "Ma, the fence is sagging again," he said, his voice low, anxious. "The post near the coop." Anna's brow furrowed, her hands pausing for a moment over the pot before she straightened, wiping her damp palms on her apron. She crossed the small space to the window, her dark eyes narrowing as she peered out into the cold, gray morning. "Damn wind," she muttered, more to herself than to the boy. "That post'll be the death of me yet." Isaac shifted in his chair, his spine creaking like the old weathered logs that framed the cabin walls, and cleared his throat. "I can fix it," he said, his voice low, cautious. Anna turned to him, her dark eyes sharp, searching his face for signs of deceit or hidden motives. Isaac met her gaze without flinching, his jaw tightening as he forced himself to hold her stare. "Ain't no trouble," he added, his voice a shade softer, almost apologetic. "I've mended worse." Anna hesitated, her sharp eyes flicking from Isaac to the boy beside her, then back again. She crossed her arms over her chest, her dark braids swaying slightly as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Finally, she gave a small, reluctant nod, her jaw tightening as if the words cost her something to speak. "All right," she said, her voice low, grudging. "If you're set on earning your keep, I won't stop you." Isaac pushed himself to his feet, his joints protesting the sudden movement, and crossed the small space to the door. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the worn wooden handle, and glanced back over his shoulder at the small firelit cabin, the boy's wide eyes still watching him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He gave the boy a small, tight-lipped nod, then stepped out into the cold, gray morning, his boots crunching through the thin crust of ice that had formed overnight. Isaac's breath fogged the frigid air as he stepped out into the gray, brittle morning. The cold hit him like a slap, sharp and biting, cutting through his worn coat and settling deep into his bones. He paused for a moment on the porch, his eyes sweeping over the snow-draped yard. The low, huddled shapes of the chicken coop and the sagging fence line just visible through the thin, gray haze. The storm had left its mark, snow piled high against the cabin walls, the wind-driven drifts forming jagged, icy shapes that clung to the base of the small, wooden structure like ghosts. The fence post Eli had mentioned leaned sharply to one side, its rough-hewn base half buried in the snow, the wire strung between the upright logs sagging dangerously low, the weight of the ice and wind-twisted branches pulling it down into the mud. Isaac stepped off the porch, his boots crunching through the thin, brittle crust that had formed overnight, and crossed the small yard. His breath coming in short, sharp gasps, the air burning his throat and lungs like cold iron. As he approached the fence, he noticed the thin, scattered tracks of small animals, their delicate, three-toed prints trailing through the snow like hurried signatures. A rabbit had burrowed beneath the low corner of the coop, its soft, gray fur leaving faint, wispy marks against the hard, wind-packed snow. He paused beside the sagging post, his gloved hand resting on the rough, splintered wood, and let his eyes wander over the yard, the thin curl of smoke rising from the cabin chimney, the dark, whispering line of trees that marked the edge of the forest beyond. He set his rifle down in the snow beside the post and knelt slowly, his knees cracking like dry branches, his gloved hands gripping the base of the leaning log. The wood was rough, splintered, its lower half darkened with rot and age, the iron nails driven into the grain rusted and loose, their heads sharp and uneven beneath his fingertips. He tested the weight of the post, rocking it gently back and forth, feeling the deep, stubborn resistance of the frozen earth that clung to its base like an old, bitter grudge. Eli's small bare feet crunched through the snow behind him, the boy's thin shadow falling across the crooked fence as he approached. "Mama says the wire's too loose," he said, his voice small but steady, the words coming in short, quick bursts as he shivered against the cold. "She says it won't hold through another storm." Isaac glanced up at the boy, his sharp gray eyes catching the thin, determined line of the child's jaw, the small, tightly clenched fists at his sides. He straightened slowly, his knees popping like distant gunfire, and reached for the worn, leather tool belt slung over his shoulder, his gloved fingers brushing the cold, hard edges of the iron nails and twisted lengths of wire nestled within. "She's right," he said, his voice low, gravelly. "But we can fix it. Just need a bit of elbow grease and some fresh timber." The boy's eyes brightened at that, his small, bare toes curling and uncurling against the cold, packed snow. He hesitated for a moment, his thin, shivering frame caught between the warmth of the cabin and the harsh, biting wind that whipped through the yard, then stepped closer, his small hands reaching for the rusted hammer and worn leather gloves Isaac held out to him. "Grab that end," Isaac said, nodding toward the loose, trailing length of wire that hung from the leaning post like a broken thread. "Hold it tight, keep it from slipping, and mind your fingers. This wire's got a mind of its own, and it don't much care for small hands." Eli nodded quickly, his small, thin fingers wrapping tightly around the cold, twisted wire, his small, determined face tightening with concentration as he braced himself against the sagging post. Isaac straightened, his breath coming in short, sharp puffs, the cold, brittle air biting at his exposed face and neck as he wrapped the end of the wire around the post and began to twist it tight, his gloved hands straining against the stubborn, rusted metal. The boy's thin arms trembled beneath the strain, his small, bare feet digging into the icy crust of the snow as he leaned his slight weight against the rough, splintered wood, his small, round face flushed with cold and effort. Isaac felt a small, unexpected pang of pride at the boy's quiet, determined strength, the thin, wiry muscles in his small arms standing out in sharp relief as he strained against the weight of the wire. They worked in silence for a long while, the only sounds the harsh, rhythmic creak of the wire as it stretched and tightened, the sharp, metallic clink of nails driven into splintered wood, the slow, labored breathing of two bodies bent against the cold. The sun crept higher in the sky as they worked, its thin, pale light glinting off the icy crust of the snow, casting long, jagged shadows across the yard as the thin gray clouds above began to break, their dark, heavy edges peeling back to reveal the pale, brittle blue of a winter sky. When the last nail had been driven into place and the wire pulled tight against the leaning post, Isaac stepped back, his gloved hands resting on his hips, his chest heaving with the cold, sharp air. He watched the boy for a moment, his sharp gray eyes catching the thin, determined line of the child's jaw, the small, tightly clenched fists at his sides, and felt a small, unexpected warmth creep into his chest, the first faint, fragile stirrings of something like hope. "Good work, kid," he said, his voice low, rough, his gloved hand reaching out to clap the boy lightly on the shoulder. "Your ma's right. You've got the makings of a fine man in you, if you keep your head on straight." Eli's small, round face broke into a shy, crooked grin, his small, dark eyes bright with pride and relief as he looked up at the tall, weathered figure beside him, the thin, pale winter sun casting their long, crooked shadows across the snow-covered yard. The wind had a bitter edge to it that morning, a sharp, cutting cold that slipped through the gaps in Isaac's coat and bit deep into his bones. He stood at the edge of the yard, his breath fogging in the thin, icy air, his sharp gray eyes fixed on the tree line just beyond the fence. The snow had settled deep in the night, laying a fresh, untouched blanket across the yard and fields, its surface marred only by the scattered, delicate tracks of small animals and the thin, winding trails of the wind that had whispered through the branches overhead. Isaac's fingers tightened around the cold, rough wood of the axe handle, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs as he watched the trees for any sign of movement, his sharp gray eyes narrowing against the glare of the low winter sun. He had seen the tracks the night before, thin, delicate prints scattered along the edge of the yard, their sharp, three-toed shapes pressed deep into the fresh, white powder like small, hurried signatures. They had come close, closer than he liked. Small, sharp-eyed creatures, quick and cunning, their thin, brittle bones wrapped in wiry gray fur, their small, sharp teeth bared against the cold. He had heard them in the night, the soft, scratching sound of claws against wood, the faint, high-pitched yip of a young one calling to its pack, the slow, rhythmic crunch of snow beneath small, careful feet. He shifted his weight, his boots creaking against the frozen, brittle snow, and stepped slowly toward the fence line, his sharp gray eyes sweeping over the low, tangled brush that clung to the base of the tall, dark trees just beyond the yard. The air was thin, cold, the sharp, metallic taste of iron and pine lingering in his mouth as he moved, his breath coming in short, quick gasps, the cold, brittle air burning his throat and lungs like a red-hot iron. He reached the edge of the yard, his boots crunching through the thin, icy crust that had formed overnight, and paused for a moment, his sharp gray eyes catching the thin, delicate line of fresh tracks scattered across the snow at the base of the fence. He knelt slowly, his knees cracking like dry branches, his gloved fingers brushing the cold, hard edges of the small three-toed prints, the sharp, delicate outlines pressed deep into the frozen, brittle crust like old scars. He traced the line of tracks with his gloved hand, his sharp gray eyes narrowing against the bright, brittle glare of the low winter sun as he followed the thin, winding trail through the snow, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs, the cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a dry winter wind. The tracks led toward the barn, their thin, delicate line winding through the snow like a thin, twisted thread. The small, sharp points of the claws pressed deep into the frozen, brittle crust, their delicate, three-toed shapes scattered across the yard like small, hurried signatures. Isaac straightened slowly, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, the cold, brittle air burning his throat and lungs like a red-hot iron, and gripped the rough, splintered handle of the axe tightly in his gloved hands, his sharp gray eyes fixed on the dark, shadowed shape of the barn door just a few yards away. He took a slow, measured step forward, his boots creaking against the frozen, brittle snow, and crossed the yard, his sharp gray eyes sweeping over the low, tangled brush that clung to the base of the tall, dark trees just beyond the fence. The thin, winding trails of the wind whispering through the branches overhead, like the soft, slow breath of a dying man. He reached the barn door, his breath coming in short, quick gasps, the cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a dry winter wind, and reached for the rough, splintered handle, his gloved fingers wrapping tightly around the cold, hard wood as he pulled the door slowly open, the thin, sharp creak of the rusted hinges echoing through the still, silent air like a dry, brittle whisper. The interior of the barn was dark, the thin, pale light of the low winter sun filtering through the small, cracked windows and falling in thin, sharp lines across the cold, hard dirt floor. The air was heavy, damp, the sharp, metallic taste of rust and iron lingering in his mouth as he stepped slowly inside, his boots creaking against the rough, splintered wood of the threshold, the thin, sharp smell of old hay and dried blood filling his nostrils like a ghost. He paused for a moment, his sharp gray eyes sweeping over the shadowed interior of the barn, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs, the cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a red-hot iron, and took a slow, measured step forward, his boots creaking against the rough, splintered wood of the threshold, the thin, sharp smell of old hay and dried blood filling his nostrils like a ghost. The small, sharp-eyed creatures were gone, their thin, wiry bodies slipping through the gaps in the rotting, splintered wood like smoke, their small, sharp teeth bared against the cold, their thin, wiry fur bristling against the sharp, biting wind that whispered through the cracks in the walls. He reached the back of the barn, his sharp gray eyes catching the thin, twisted line of fresh tracks scattered across the cold, hard dirt floor, their thin, delicate outlines pressed deep into the frozen, brittle crust like old scars. Isaac straightened slowly, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, the cold, brittle air burning his throat and lungs like a red-hot iron, and turned slowly, his sharp gray eyes fixed on the dark, shadowed shape of the open barn door just a few yards away. The thin, pale light of the low, winter sun filtering through the small, cracked windows and falling in thin, sharp lines across the cold, hard dirt floor. He tightened his grip on the rough, splintered handle of the axe, his sharp gray eyes narrowing against the bright, brittle glare of the low winter sun as he stepped slowly out of the barn, his boots creaking against the frozen, brittle snow and crossed the yard, his sharp gray eyes sweeping over the low, tangled brush that clung to the base of the tall, dark trees just beyond the fence. The tracks led into the trees, their thin, twisted line winding through the snow like a thin, twisted thread, the small, sharp points of the claws pressed deep into the frozen, brittle crust, their delicate three-toed shapes scattered across the yard like small, hurried signatures. Isaac watched the tree line for a long moment, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs, the cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a red-hot iron, then turned slowly, his sharp gray eyes sweeping over the snow-covered yard as he stepped slowly toward the cabin, his boots creaking against the frozen, brittle snow. Isaac woke before the first hint of dawn, the cabin still wrapped in the cold, dark grasp of winter. The fire had burned low, the last embers pulsing faintly like a dying heartbeat beneath the gray ash. He pulled himself up from the rough wool blanket that had become his bed on the cabin floor, his joints stiff, his muscles aching from days of hard labor and long, silent nights. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, the faint, brittle sound of snow sifting from the branches like dry, rustling paper. The air was sharp and bitter, the kind of cold that settled deep into the bones and refused to leave. Isaac could feel it in his teeth, in the tightness of his chest, in the slow, dull ache that had taken up permanent residence in his lower back. He rose slowly, his breath fogging in the thin, icy air, and crossed the small, cramped space of the cabin, his boots scuffing against the rough, splintered wood of the floor. He reached for the small, battered stove, the iron surface cold beneath his calloused fingers, and stoked the dying fire, feeding it with thin, brittle branches and the last handful of dry kindling. The flames caught slowly, a thin, flickering line of orange that licked against the blackened iron walls of the stove. its faint, wavering light casting long, thin shadows across the walls of the cabin. He crouched beside the stove, his hands outstretched to the thin, feeble heat, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs, the cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a dry, winter wind. He watched the flames for a long moment, his sharp gray eyes fixed on the thin, flickering light, his mind drifting back to the dream that had woken him. It had been the same dream, the one that haunted him every night, the one that followed him through the long, dark hours of winter and the slow, bitter days of spring. He had dreamed of fire, of smoke, of the sharp, acrid taste of burning flesh, and the thin, brittle sound of a woman's voice calling his name through the darkness. He had dreamed of blood, of pain, of loss, and of a promise he had made long ago, a promise he had never had the chance to keep. The fire crackled softly, the thin, sharp sound of the dry, brittle branches snapping and popping in the heat, and Isaac rose slowly, his joints creaking like old, rusted hinges. He crossed the cabin in slow, measured steps, his boots creaking against the rough, splintered wood of the floor, and reached for the battered leather satchel that hung beside the door. He pulled it down, the thin, cracked straps creaking beneath his calloused fingers, and opened it slowly, his sharp gray eyes scanning the contents with a practiced, careful gaze. Inside were the few belongings he had managed to keep over the years, the small, battered relics of a life that had slipped through his fingers like sand. He reached inside, his fingers brushing against the thin, worn leather of an old journal, the rough, splintered handle of a knife, the cold, smooth metal of a battered, tarnished badge. He pulled the badge free, his sharp gray eyes narrowing against the thin, pale light of the rising sun as he turned it slowly in his hands. The small engraved letters, catching the light like old, forgotten promises. U.S. Marshal. The words felt strange in his mouth, bitter, metallic, like old blood. He turned the badge slowly in his fingers, his sharp gray eyes tracing the thin, delicate lines of the worn, tarnished metal. The small engraved letters that had once meant something, that had once stood for something, that had once marked him as a man of the law, a man of honor, a man with a purpose. He closed his fingers slowly around the badge, his sharp gray eyes narrowing against the thin, pale light of the rising sun, and slipped it back into the satchel. The thin, cracked leather creaking beneath his calloused fingers like dry, brittle paper. He closed the satchel slowly, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs, the cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a dry, winter wind, and slung it over his shoulder, the thin, cracked straps digging into his shoulders like the weight of old regrets. He crossed the cabin in slow, measured steps, his boots creaking against the rough, splintered wood of the floor, and reached for the door, his gloved fingers wrapping tightly around the cold, hard iron of the handle. He pulled the door slowly open, the thin, sharp creak of the rusted hinges echoing through the still, silent air like a dry, brittle whisper, and stepped out into the cold, biting wind of the winter morning. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the thin, brittle crust breaking beneath his weight like old, dried bones, and he paused for a moment, his sharp gray eyes sweeping over the snow-covered yard, the thin, twisted branches of the trees beyond the fence line, the thin, pale light of the rising sun catching the sharp, jagged edges of the ice that clung to the branches like shattered glass. He tightened his grip on the rough, splintered handle of the axe that hung from his belt, his sharp gray eyes narrowing against the bright, brittle glare of the low winter sun, and took a slow, measured step forward, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs, the cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a red-hot iron. He crossed the yard in slow, measured steps, his boots creaking against the frozen, brittle snow, and reached the tree line, his sharp gray eyes sweeping over the thin, tangled brush that clung to the base of the tall, dark trees just beyond the fence. The thin, winding trails of the wind whispering through the branches overhead like the soft, slow breath of a dying man. He paused for a moment, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs, the cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a dry, winter wind, and reached for the battered, tarnished badge that hung from the strap of his satchel. his gloved fingers wrapping tightly around the cold, smooth metal as he stepped slowly into the trees. The thin, pale light of the rising sun casting long, thin shadows across the snow-covered ground, like old forgotten promises. And as he moved through the trees, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs, the cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a red-hot iron, he felt something shift inside him, something hard and brittle, something old and broken, something that had been locked away for far too long. And so, as the last embers of winter faded and the hard, bitter ground began to thaw, Isaac found something he'd thought lost forever, a purpose, a place to stand, and the quiet, stubborn promise of a second chance. But what do you think? Would you have trusted a man with a past like Isaac's? Do you believe someone can truly change when they have walked such a dark path? And where do you think this story should head next? Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what you think will come next for Isaac and his new family. I'd love to hear your thoughts as we keep this wild journey going. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next chapter.